Let's stand for the gospel reading. And this morning I'm reading from an inclusive version put out by Oxford University Press. So this is an inclusive version of John chapter 14, starting at verse 15. Jesus said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I will ask God, who will give you another comforter to be with you forever. This is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees nor knows the Spirit. You know the Spirit because the Spirit abides with you and will be in you. I will not leave you orphaned, I am coming to you. In a little while the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Because I live, you also will live. On that day you will know that I am in God, and you are in me, and I am in you." May God bless the reading of this word. May we each hear a word for us this morning. Amen. Well, this morning I'm giving a message on one of my favorite topics in the Bible, and that is the topic of the still small voice, or the Comforter, as is said in our reading today. Well, after Jesus left the earth, he said that he would not leave us desolate, that he would come to us in the form of the Holy Spirit, which he called the Counselor. Now, I have a friend who lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Her name's Ruth, and she's a family counselor. And I asked Ruth, I said, "Ruth, what makes a really, really good counselor?" And she said, well, Amos, it all boils down to listening. A good counselor is a deep listener. And I said, "Well, Ruth, what does that look like?" She said, "Well, to listen deeply, you have to clear your mind of all distractions, and you have to focus on each and every word that your client is giving." And she said then, to make sure that the client understands that they're being listened to, she said, I pause after they pause, and I re-encapsulate whatever they've said in a fresh new way, and I speak it back to them in a way that they haven't heard it before. So it's just a different angle on everything they've just been saying. And she went on to say that in her mind, the best counselors, they only speak about 5% of the time. They actually listen 95% of the time. And I thought to myself during this conversation, what a great gift. What an amazing gift that Ruth gives to her clients. And just think of how much more understanding there would be in the world if there were more listeners. And so Ruth is a listener. She is a counselor. And this is what makes the Holy Spirit the counselor in our lives, is that the Spirit listens deeply for our hearts and understands our hearts. And even before we say a word, the Spirit apprehends what's on our hearts. And the Spirit knows us better than we know ourselves. You know, sometimes I think I've listened, I think I understand, when I don't. And I'm only reminded of that later. But it's not so with the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit listens deeply to our hearts and understands. The Holy Spirit listens and then nudges us. And sometimes those nudges are so practical. You know, go ahead and meet that person again, that person that you met the other day. You know, that's going to be a good life-giving thing for you. Or why don't you write this email to your dad, and why don't you word it in this way? But don't call him on the phone, and do it tomorrow, not yesterday. And the Spirit is like that. The Spirit nudges us into life-giving ways. Go ahead and make that phone call. Well, counseling, like the kind that my friend Ruth does, is great, yet spiritual counsel is even of greater value, because then we can listen for the Holy Spirit in our lives. How do we find the path to God, and how do we stay on it? Well, the saints tell us to listen deeply, and in the silence of our hearts, the counselor will speak to us. Now, this sounds good in theory, but it's very difficult. How can we silence the din around us long enough to listen deeply? And if we do make the time out of our very busy lives and have the patience to listen deeply, my mother had a prayer room that she carved out for herself, and she woke up before the kids woke up so she could have this special time, because it wouldn't happen any other time. Well, she tells the story that my sister and I kind of got wind that Mom was up, and maybe we could have some one-on-one time with Mom. So I started getting up a little earlier and barging into that room. And that's, that's one time that Mom kind of, her boundaries are pretty strong. And she said, Amos, this is my time. She said, you go back to sleep. And she was tough because she guarded that time. Well, if we have the patience to listen deeply, are we sure that we will even hear the Holy Spirit? Well, this reminds me of when I used to go visit my grandfather in New York City. Now, my grandfather at the time was 98 years old. And I would go to this assisted living place in New York City, and I'd listen to my grandpa. And, I could only make out about a third of what he said. I just wasn't getting it. I mean, for one thing, he kind of held his head like this, and then he spoke in just kind of a whisper, and he had that thick New York accent, and it was just hard for me to hear. So, but then finally, I got this notion that what I should do is pull my chair up right up to my grandpa, and put my ear, just lean in, and put my ear right by his mouth. And the amazing thing is, I got a lot more at that point. I started understanding about half. I mean, it was good, And this is what I think this is what it means to listen for the Holy Spirit. It takes a lot of patience, and you got to really lean in. And you remember Elijah? I think he really thought that God was going to be on all the fireworks, the big earthquake and fire and everything. But then it's the still small voice, and that's when Elijah wrapped his head in his mantle, and he knew he was standing on holy ground. And so I love that rendition and Christiane read from the King James Version. And sometimes I just have to read a little King James, because that phrase, the still small voice, what an awesome phrase. Sometimes in prayer, if we're honest with ourselves, we feel like we're leaning in, we're trying to listen, but in all honesty, we feel like we're talking to an empty chair. And we enter into prayer convinced that we're listening to an empty chair. And it's at that point that we get into this one-way conversation where we're just talking, and it feels like we're talking to the wall. I mean, there's no response. Now, Teresa of Avila, who's one of the great mystics of our tradition, she said that the greatest mistake, the biggest mistake that we make in prayer, is praying as if God is absent. And this is indeed the problem with most of us, and it's the problem that we encounter, that we feel that God is absent. Yet the turning point in prayer is when we finally stop talking, and we close our eyes, and we trust that the counselor is indeed there. And we lean in and we listen as long as it takes. And this is an act of faith. It's an amazing thing, because as we wait, the empty chair begins to feel more and more occupied. We begin to feel the warm breath against the cheek. We begin to brush up against an actual being. Then we see the Ancient One who was sitting there all along. We just couldn't see it before.